Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 19 stories for you, including the occupant of the hollow, the passenger in row 14, the metronome in the masonry, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The occupant of the hollow. The seismograph hut sits on a ridge that never truly sleeps. It is a small, circular structure of cedar and copper, perched where the earth hums with a low-frequency vibration. I spent my months there alone, recording the subterranean heartbeat of the world. The isolation was comfortable until I downloaded Aura, a simple utility app designed to track personal movement across vast distances. It didn't require a name or a profile. It simply asked for permission to share your coordinates with the observer. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed the data went into a cloud server or a laboratory in some distant city. But one Tuesday, while the ground was shivering with a minor tremor, my phone buzzed. A notification appeared. The observer is 40 feet away. I looked around the empty hut. There was nothing but my chair, my instruments, and the dusting of frost on the window pane. The sensation of being watched began as a physical weight, like a thick velvet curtain draped over the air. Every time I blinked, I felt it, a presence that wasn't quite there, yet occupied every inch of space. The app updated again. The observer is 10 feet away. It was standing by the copper stove, though no shadow appeared on the floor. When I finally turned my head to face it, the air rippled like a stone thrown into a pond. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a shifting mass of texture and heat. It looked like woven bronze thread fused with velvet moss, a dense cluster of shimmering fibers that pulsed with a soft, amber glow. It had no face, only a surface of undulating ridges that smoothed out when it moved. As I sat on my cot to write in my logbook, the app chimed. The observer is 2 feet away. I felt a sudden draft of warmth against my left shoulder. The entity wasn't just near me, it was mimicking my posture. It leaned over the desk, its bronze fibers humming like a distant beehive. By nightfall, the fear became visceral. The ridge seemed to hold its breath. Every time I moved, the app tracked the closing gap with agonizing precision. I began to notice that whenever I sat down, the air would compress around me, as if something were molding itself to my shape. One evening, exhausted by the constant proximity of this shimmering mass, I laid down on my narrow bed and pulled the heavy wool blanket over my chest. I closed my eyes, prepared for sleep, but the app gave one final vibration. The observer is 0 feet away. In that instant, the weight shifted. It wasn't just near me anymore. It was occupying the space I had just vacated. As I lay there, still half awake, I felt a sudden, searing heat bloom in the pillow behind my head and the sheets beneath my hips. The entity hadn't just moved into my personal space. It had settled into the physical indentation my body left in the fabric. It took the hollow of my spine and filled it with its own bronze-threaded substance. I could feel it smoothing out the wrinkles of the wool, warming the cold spot where my head had rested, pressing into the curve of my shoulder as if trying to memorize the geometry of my frame. I lay perfectly still, paralyzed by the sensation of something solid yet fluid filling the vacuum of my existence. It was a perfect fit, a seamless transition from flesh to fiber. Just as I began to drift into sleep, I realized the heat wasn't just coming from its body, it was radiating from the very center of where I had been. The entity didn't want to replace me. It wanted to inhabit my absence. It stayed there, a heavy, humming weight in the curve of the mattress, vibrating with the rhythm of a heart that wasn't mine. When I finally reached out to touch it, my hand sank into the warm, velvet ridges as if plunging into thick honey. The app flickered one last time, the screen glowing in the dark. The observer is inside. I realized then that while my body was still there, it had become a guest in its own skin, while the thing that had lived in my hollow was now perfectly comfortable holding my shape. The passenger in row 14. I started telling my daughter the story because I couldn't bear to keep the silence of that flight inside my own head. It began on a red-eye from London to New York, a journey where the hum of the engines became a lullaby for 40 weary travelers. About 3 hours into the crossing, the cabin lights flickered once and then died completely. We weren't plunged into total darkness, but rather a heavy, thick gloom illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the tiny windows and the occasional, rhythmic pulse of the navigation beacons outside. It was in this soup of shadow that I noticed my phone screen glowing. My thumb hovered over the group chat titled, The Inner Circle. It was a mess of memories, a thread shared with 5 of my closest friends who had all passed away within the last year. In the silence of the cabin, it felt strange to have their digital presence so close. Then, the first notification pinged. A vibration hummed against my palm in the quiet air. "Are you still awake?" the text read. It was from Elias, who died 3 months ago in a hiking accident. I smiled, my breath hitching slightly in the cold cabin air. I typed back, "Always." Almost instantly, a flurry of bubbles appeared as if everyone were responding at once. "The coffee is getting cold," came Sarah's message, followed by Mark, Julian, and Chloe all chiming in with short, punchy observations about sleep and dreams. The bizarre thing was that the plane felt heavier. The other passengers were still there. I could hear them breathing, their occasional snores blending into a collective rhythm, but they weren't looking at their phones. They seemed to be staring into the void of the darkened aisle. I looked up from my screen and saw it for the first time, a figure standing near the galley. It was tall, its body draped in fabric that looked like heavy, moth-eaten velvet, textured with tiny iridescent scales that caught what little light remained. The dancer stood perfectly motionless, its feet rooted to the carpeted floor. However, as I watched, its silhouette on the wall behind it began to move. While the dancer itself remained as still as a statue, its shadow swayed from side to side like a willow branch in a breeze, fluid and graceful, tracing an invisible path in the air. The shadow was larger than the body, stretching toward the ceiling, its movements elegant and sweeping. I felt a prickle of heat on my neck. Then, the group chat erupted again. "Don't look at the one in the velvet," Chloe messaged. My heart skipped. I didn't want to look, but the shadow was swaying faster now, the silhouette carving arcs through the gloom. It was as if the dancer was performing a private ballet for an audience of ghosts. I realized then that while the shadow moved, the dancer remained frozen in a pose of reaching outward, its hand extended toward the middle row. The other passengers began to stir, their heads turning in unison toward the figure. A collective hush fell over the cabin. One by one, people started to whisper. "Is it moving?" someone murmured from 3 rows back. I looked at my phone again. A new message appeared from Elias, but this time, it wasn't a sentence. It was just a single word, "Listen." In that moment, the humming of the engines seemed to drop an octave, becoming a deep, resonant thrum. The shadow on the wall suddenly jerked, spinning in a violent, clockwise circle while the dancer remained anchored in its reaching pose. Then, with a soft sound like silk sliding over stone, the shadow stopped moving entirely. The dancer's physical body remained still, but its silhouette was now perfectly horizontal, lying flat against the wall as if it had fallen asleep. A strange, peaceful silence washed over us for exactly 10 seconds. I felt a sense of relief, thinking the entity had finished its performance. But then, the group chat chimed one final time. Every single friend, Elias, Sarah, Mark, Julian, and Chloe, sent a message at the exact same millisecond. It was the same word from all 5 of them, "Turn." I looked toward the front of the plane, where the shadow had been, and saw that the dancer had finally moved its head to face me. It wasn't just looking at me, it was waiting for me to acknowledge that it was no longer just a reflection on the wall, but the only thing truly awake in the cabin. The metronome in the masonry. Listen up. Look at those lockers, and look at the way they're sweating against the brick. You aren't just standing in a room, you are standing inside a ribcage. And right now, something is breathing between your ribs and the walls. Every night, when the city bridge shuts down its lanes and the tires stop screaming against the asphalt, I sit in that toll booth alone with the masonry. It's a lonely post, isn't it? Just me, the glass, and the hum. But the hum doesn't start until the first car passes at midnight. At first, it's just a vibration, a low, steady thrumming deep inside the limestone blocks of the booth. You think it's the wind, but the wind doesn't have a pulse. It's the masonry speaking back to you. Around 1 a.m., the knocking begins. It starts as a single tap on the left wall, then another on the right. They aren't random. They are rhythmic, deliberate, and they follow a sequence. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. It's like someone is testing the structural integrity of your sanity with a knuckle made of velvet. But here is the secret. The knocking isn't coming from something hitting the wall from the outside. It is coming from something pushing out from within. By 2 a.m., the hum changes. It stops being a background noise and starts to synchronize. You know that feeling when you're running and your heart finds its own steady pace? The entity in the walls does that with the sound. It hears your pulse, thump thump, thump thump, and it mimics it perfectly. It's an apprentice learning a master's melody. But it isn't content to just copy you, it wants to improve upon you. By 3 a.m., the humming becomes aggressive. You feel your own heart begin to quicken because the wall is demanding more from you. The hum starts to race. It moves from a steady trot to a frantic sprint. Your chest tightens. Your breath hitches. Your pulse begins to mirror the Masonry's ambition. It's a coach pushing an athlete, and the Masonry is trying to force your heart to beat faster than it ever has before. Then comes the 4 a.m. shift. The walls stop being solid. They start to bulge inward, as if something massive is pressing its face against the stone from the inside out. The humming reaches a fever pitch, a rapid-fire staccato that vibrates in your teeth and makes your vision blur. You can see the texture of the limestone shifting like water. Every time you blink, the wall moves an inch closer to your shoulders. It wants your speed. It wants your intensity. The humming becomes a roar of vibration, so fast it feels like the booth is about to shatter into dust. Your heart is pounding against your ribs like a trapped bird trying to break out of a cage. You are no longer just observing the hum. You are becoming the engine for it. At 4:30 a.m., the knocking stops completely. The humming reaches its zenith, a blur of sound so fast it almost becomes a single, continuous note. Then everything goes silent. The silence is heavier than the noise was. You hold your breath, waiting for the wall to collapse. Then you hear it. A final, wet sound from directly in front of your face. It isn't a knock or a hum. It's the sound of something finally breaking through the surface. The limestone cracks right in the center of the booth, peeling back like a piece of fruit skin. A face emerges. It doesn't have eyes or hair. It is a smooth, polished surface of warm amber glass, shaped like a wide, flat oval. It has no mouth, yet it radiates the feeling of a long-held note. It leans forward, its weight pressing against your chest until you can feel the warmth of its skin. It opens a tiny slit at the top of its amber face, not a mouth, but an intake. It takes a deep breath, and for a second, it feels like it's sucking the air right out of your lungs to fill itself up. Then, with a gentle shove, it settles into the space between you and the wall, becoming your permanent companion. The humming starts again, but this time, it isn't coming from the masonry anymore. It is coming from its throat, perfectly mimicking the exact rhythm of your heart. As I reached out to touch its smooth amber surface, I felt it pulse in perfect unison with my own chest, and I realized that while it had learned my speed, it was now waiting for me to provide it with more life. The echo in the frost. I am recording this because my memory is failing, and I need to anchor the truth before the silence of the mountain swallows it completely. We were trapped for 3 days by a blizzard that turned the ridge into a white void. My wife, Elara, was already asleep when the frost began to bite at our skin, and I had spent hours carving out our sanctuary, a snow cave tucked deep into the lee of a jagged cliff. It felt safe, a womb of packed powder and ice. But on the second night, we heard the first sound that didn't belong to the wind. It was a wet, rhythmic thrumming, like a heavy heart beating against a leather drum. Then came the crying. Our newborn, Leo, let out a sharp, melodic wail that pierced the muffled quiet of the cave. He stayed unsettled for an hour, his tiny fists clenched, until I did something instinctive and irrational. I cupped my hands around his mouth and shouted back his own cry, mimicking the exact pitch of his first scream. The moment he heard his own voice reflected by mine, he fell into a deep, peaceful slumber. That was when the scratching began outside the cave entrance. It wasn't the scrape of wood or stone. It sounded like velvet being dragged over sandpaper. I peered out into the swirling white and saw it, a low, four-legged creature hunkering in the drift. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Its entire body was covered in thousands of tiny, fur-like eyelids, each one fringed with microscopic lashes. Most were closed, giving the beast a textured, pebbled appearance like a stone fruit, but as it moved, different patches of its skin would blink independently. It didn't have ears or a nose. It simply sensed the vibration of our existence. It moved toward us with a heavy, rolling gait, its eyelids fluttering in a chaotic sequence, some wide open, some squeezed shut, some halfway between. It seemed to be tasting the air with its gaze. The next night, the creature didn't stay outside. It crept into the cave, its weight pressing against the snow walls with a soft hum. Leo woke up and began to shriek, his voice bouncing off the curved ceiling. The creature moved toward him, its body a shimmering mass of blinking textures. Every time it took a step, a cluster of eyelids would snap open simultaneously, revealing pupils that were not round, but shaped like tiny, perfect hexagons. It hovered over Leo, and then it did something peculiar. It didn't just watch him. It seemed to inhale his sound. As it breathed in the cry, its eyelids began to pulse. Then, it exhaled a perfect recreation of Leo's wail, though it sounded slightly deeper, more resonant. The baby stopped crying instantly. He reached out a small hand and touched one of the creature's blinking patches. It felt like touching wet silk stretched over a warm pebble. For 2 days, we lived in this strange rhythm. Leo would cry, the beast would listen, and then it would give his own voice back to him. But by the 3rd night, the blizzard died down and the silence became heavy. The creature was no longer content just echoing. It began to mimic the timing of our movements. When Alara sighed, 100 eyelids on its flank would flutter in sync. When I moved my hand, a row of lids near its front paws would blink in a rapid staccato. It was learning us. On the final morning, as we prepared to crawl out into the sunlight, Leo let out a tiny, sleepy whimper, a sound he had only made once before. The creature reacted instantly. It didn't wait for him to finish. Before the sound could even hit the cave walls, it exhaled the exact same whimpering tone, perfectly timed with his breath. Then, it did something that made my blood turn to slush. It stood up on its 4 legs and opened every single one of its thousands of eyelids at once. The sheer volume of blinking was like a soft rain of clicking sounds. Leo stopped moving entirely, his eyes wide. He wasn't just hearing himself anymore. He was watching the creature consume his identity. As we finally stepped out into the crisp air, I turned back to see it sitting in the center of our cave, its body still. It didn't move as we left, but I could see that it had changed. One patch of eyelids on its side remained wide open, staring at the spot where Leo had been lying, waiting for him to provide another sound. The dancer of the laundry room. The thunder didn't just shake the house. It vibrated in my marrow, a low-frequency hum that made the laundry room feel like the belly of a great wooden whale. I sat on a rickety stool, watching the rhythm of the dryer, a steady, mechanical heartbeat against the erratic percussion of rain hitting the basement windows. It was a chore of solitude until I noticed the phone. It was my old mobile, sitting atop the folding table, its screen glowing with a soft, ghostly luminescence. I hadn't touched it in hours, yet the call log was scrolling incessantly. Every time I blinked, a new entry appeared. They were numbers I didn't recognize, strange, jagged sequences like 09-88-42 and 11-33-76. I knew for a fact that I hadn't touched the keypad, yet the phone was buzzing with incoming calls from voices that felt less like sound and more like memories of things I had forgotten to say. There was no name attached to them, just the raw data of connection. As the storm intensified, the lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the concrete walls. That was when I saw it, the dancer. It stood in the corner by the washing machine, a figure composed of shimmering, iridescent scales that caught the dim light like oil on water. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head was a smooth, pearlescent dome with 3 vertical slits that pulsed with a soft amber glow. The dancer stood perfectly still, frozen in a pose of deep reverence, one arm curved toward its chest. However, its shadow cast against the far wall by the overhead bulb wasn't still at all. While the body remained motionless, the silhouette was swaying rhythmically, tracing elegant, sweeping arcs as if it were performing a slow waltz through invisible air. The disconnect between the static body and the fluid shadow made my skin crawl. I reached out to touch its shoulder, but as my hand moved forward, the shadow on the wall jerked with a violent, sudden grace, spinning in a full circle while the dancer itself didn't budge an inch. "Are you moving, or is your soul dancing?" I whispered to the empty air. The phone chimed again. A new number appeared, 00-00-01. Suddenly, the shadow stopped swaying and stretched out, becoming impossibly long, reaching across the floor toward my feet like a needle of ink. The dancer's amber slits pulsed faster, and I felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. The washing machine groaned, its cycle ending with a heavy thud that echoed through the rafters. In that silence, the shadow didn't just move, it detached from the wall. It pulled on the floor like spilled ink, creeping toward me with deliberate intent. It wasn't a flat shape anymore, it had depth, a velvety texture that seemed to drink the light around it. As it reached my toes, the dancer finally moved. It didn't walk, it pirouetted, its iridescent scales clacking together like porcelain beads. It spun toward me, and as it did, the shadow on the wall mirrored the movement perfectly, expanding until it covered every inch of the masonry. The phone began to ring again, a frantic, high-pitched trill that matched the dancer's spinning pace. I stood up, my breath hitching in my throat, watching the entity glide closer. It stopped just inches from my face, its pearlescent dome glowing with an intensity that blurred the edges of the room. The shadow on the wall was no longer a reflection. It had become a thick, heavy curtain of darkness that seemed to be pulling me inward. I reached out and grasped the dancer's arm, feeling the strange, cool texture of its scales. For a moment, everything went silent, no thunder, no hum of the dryer, just the weight of the entity's presence. Then, the shadow suddenly snapped back onto the wall, pinning itself flat against the stone. The dancer remained where it was, but as I pulled my hand away, I realized something was wrong. My own shadow wasn't following me anymore. It had stayed behind, caught on the floor by the dancer's feet. I looked down at my feet and saw my own silhouette, stretched out, reaching toward the entity, while I stood there, unanchored. The dancer bowed slightly, its amber slits dimming to a faint spark. Then, with one final, graceful sweep of its shadow, it vanished into the wall, leaving only the smell of ozone and wet stone behind. I looked at my feet again, realizing that even though I was standing still, my shadow was still slowly swaying on the floor as if it were waiting for the music to start again. The inventory of the vanishing year. I am writing this list for whoever finds my satchel by the shoreline. If you are reading these words, it means I have finally surrendered my turn to the frame. Please pack carefully. Every item here has been tested against the dampness of the swamp and the hunger of the portrait. We set off just as the last airboat hummed into the mist, leaving us alone on the boardwalk that stretches like a rotting spine over the peat. The fog here isn't just weather, it is a heavy, wet wool that muffles sound and makes the distance feel deceptive. My primary task was to keep track of the mole. It is not a creature of fur or scale, but a localized anomaly, a spot of dense, humming silence that moves through the swamp like a hidden weight. Every time I paused to check for it, it had migrated to somewhere new, lurking just beyond my periphery. But the true master of this journey is the portrait. It hangs from a heavy oak plank at the center of the boardwalk, suspended by rusted chains. The entity within the frame is not a static painting, it is a living theft. Every year that I keep for myself, every birthday, every season of growth, every moment of conscious thought, the portrait steals. In its place, it ages. When we began, the figure in the frame was a vibrant youth with hair the color of toasted wheat and skin like polished copper. It had a wide, expectant grin and eyes that held the spark of 1,000 unlived memories. However, as I walked the boardwalk, the portrait began to trade my vitality for its own antiquity. By the 3rd hour, the youth's hair began to thin into silver threads. By the 6th hour, the copper skin wrinkled into deep grooves, and the grin widened into a line of weary satisfaction. It doesn't just get older, it absorbs the newness of my own life. I felt my knees ache as the figure's shoulders slumped. I felt my memory of my mother's face blur as the figure's brow furrowed with deep, permanent lines. The portrait is a jealous thief. It resents every year I hold on to. It wants to be old so that I can remain young, but it demands a fair exchange. Is it hungry yet? I whispered to the mist, my voice sounding thin against the damp air. The only answer was the steady drip of condensation from the oak plank. I reached for my canteen, and as I did, the mole appeared again. It wasn't in the reeds this time. It was sitting on a plank just 3 feet ahead. It felt like a lump in the fabric of reality, a heavy pressure that made the air vibrate. When I blinked, it vanished, reappearing further down the boardwalk near a cluster of weeping willow roots. The mole is the heartbeat of the swamp, a shifting pulse that reminds us that the scenery is never permanent. As the fog thickened into a milky soup, the portrait underwent its most violent transformation. The copper skin turned to the color of weathered parchment. The hair became a mane of snowy white. Its eyes, once bright and sharp, became soft pools of amber, heavy with the weight of centuries. I could feel my own pulse slowing. My hands, which had been steady when we started, were now trembling with the fatigue of an old man. "Take what you need," I sighed, leaning against a railing that felt colder than it should. I looked at the portrait one last time before the final stretch. The figure was no longer just an old man. He was a titan of antiquity, his face etched with 1,000 years of stolen experiences. He didn't look like a painting anymore. He looked like a memory that had been lived by someone else. The mole gave one final jump, appearing right at my feet, as if waiting for me to step into its space. I took the final step forward, my legs heavy, and felt my own skin tighten over my bones, my hair turning white in a sudden, shimmering rush. I am no longer the traveler. I am the gift left behind. The portrait now holds my 30 years, making it look like a man of middle age with a thoughtful gaze, while I have become the ghost of the boardwalk. If you find this list, do not fear the portrait's face. It is only hungry for what we leave behind. I am still here, though my body has merged with the timber, watching as the next traveler walks toward the frame to see what they will lose. The threshold of the Gale. To whoever takes the midnight shift on the MS Ethelgard, listen closely. The ferry is usually a sanctuary of predictable motion, a steady cradle of wood and iron cutting through the brine. But when the storm hits the deep channel, that bruised stretch of water where the currents tangle like knotted rope, the atmosphere shifts from nautical to spiritual. You will be stationed on the upper observation deck, a wide expanse of weathered timber and brass railings that overlooks the churning whitecaps. It is a lonely post. Most passengers retreat to the warmth of the dining hall, seeking the safety of amber light and the smell of roasted meat, leaving you alone with the salt spray and the rhythmic, mournful groan of the hull against the tide. It is peaceful for the first hour, or so it seems. You can lean against the railing, feeling the vibration of the engine deep in your marrow. But then, the wind reaches that specific, low-frequency hum, a subterranean note that resonates not just in your ears, but in your very bones. It makes your teeth ache slightly, a dull thrumming that signals the transition. That is when you must watch the crowd. On a standard night, there are about 40 people scattered across the deck. They don't interact much. They are huddled in pairs or standing alone, faces turned toward the horizon, their hair whipped into frantic patterns by the gale. But tonight, the air feels heavy, as if the storm is holding its breath, waiting for a cue that has yet to be given. The spray of the sea seems to hang in beads before falling, and the roar of the wind drops to a conspiratorial whisper. You will notice them first, a group of 5 near the starboard railing and a dozen more lounging on the benches. They are all perfectly still, despite the swaying motion of the ship. It is a collective trance, a shared moment of profound observation. Their eyes are wide, reflecting the gray-green water. Then, the hum in your teeth will intensify until it becomes a physical pressure against your skull. The rain will stop falling for exactly 3 seconds, suspended in midair like a curtain of diamonds, frozen in time between the clouds and the timber. In that silence, you will see it. At the very edge of the deck, where the shadow of the mast creates a perfect rectangular void against the churning sea, something is waiting. It doesn't have a body until it chooses to manifest. It borrows the exact silhouette of the doorway-shaped shadow on the wood. It looks like a frame of a painting made of solid velvet, approximately 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide. For a heartbeat, it is merely a shape, a vacancy in the world. Then, with a sound like wet silk sliding over stone, it steps out of that shadow frame into our reality. This entity is not a ghost in the traditional sense. It does not haunt so much as it inhabits. It possesses a textured surface resembling hammered copper mixed with iridescent beetle wings, shimmering even in the dim light. It has no face, but rather a series of vertical ridges that pulse with a faint, amber glow like cooling embers. It moves with a liquid grace, its heavy, multi-jointed limbs making a soft clicking noise as they meet the deck boards. As it steps forward, the crowd reacts. This is the moment you must prepare for. Every single passenger, all 40 of them, stops looking at the horizon and turns their heads toward you simultaneously. There is no delay, no gradual movement. It is a synchronized pivot of necks and shoulders that creates a collective thump of fabric against skin. They are not just looking at you, they are acknowledging your presence as the observer, the one who witnessed its emergence from the void. The creature reaches out with a limb that resembles a twisted root covered in velvet moss and touches your shoulder. Its touch is neither hot nor cold, but feels like the sensation of pressing your palm against a smooth river stone, solid, certain, and ancient. You will feel its weight, a comforting heaviness that anchors you to the deck as if it were, trying to pull you into its own quiet realm. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the creature retreats back into the shadow frame, becoming part of the woodwork once more. The rain resonates with a sudden roar, splashing against the brass and sending a fresh spray into your face. The crowd remains perfectly still, their eyes still fixed on yours. You can go back to your duties then, but do not look at the shadow until the sun rises. The Scribe of the projection booth. I never expected to find a ghost in a place where light is meant to be constant. The old Starlight Drive-In had been closed since 1984, its massive screen now a jagged teeth-like ridge against the horizon. I spent my weekends there alone, seeking the silence of the projection booth, a cramped wooden cube perched atop the main tower. It smelled of ozone, dust, and old celluloid. Most people thought the booth was empty, but as I sat in that velvet chair, clutching a battered rotary phone and a stack of sticky notes, I realized I wasn't alone. It started on a Tuesday. The air was heavy with humidity, and I had left a single yellow note on the workbench. "Who is here?" When I returned an hour later, there were 2. My handwriting, a messy, slanted cursive, had been mimicked perfectly on the second note. It read, "I am listening." The next day, I found 3 notes. They weren't just copied, they were expanding. One note sat on my lap, one on the floor, and a third was stuck to the ceiling. My handwriting was unmistakable, yet the messages felt deliberate. By the 3rd day, the notes began to appear in places I hadn't touched. A note was tucked into the handle of the projector lamp. Another was stuck to the glass pane of the booth door. They started signing things for me. "I agree to share your chair," one read. "I promise not to speak until you do," said another. The handwriting was identical to mine, down to the way I looped my Y's and crossed my T's, but it felt heavier, as if it had been pressed onto the paper with more intent than a human hand could manage. Then came the phone calls. They started in the middle of the night when the drive-in was swallowed by shadows. I would be sitting in the booth, the smell of old grease clinging to my sweater, and the rotary would give a sharp, rhythmic trill. When I picked up the receiver, there was no voice. Instead, there was a sound, a soft, humid exhale. It was the sound of someone breathing into the mouthpiece from just an inch away. But here was the strangest part. Whenever I held my own breath to listen, the breathing would stop instantly. The moment my lungs stayed still, its breath would freeze in midair. It was as if the entity was waiting for me to notice it, a phantom synchronization of air. On Friday, the notes became frantic. They weren't just observations anymore, they were contracts. "I sign your name into the dust," one note said. I hadn't even touched the dust. "I claim the corner of your shadow," read another. Each time, my own handwriting would appear on the page, but there was a strange texture to it. The ink felt slightly raised, as if the letters were made of tiny, dried beads of resin rather than flat liquid. I began to notice that whenever I entered the booth, the notes were always placed in pairs, one mine and one its. They were beginning to merge. By Sunday, the atmosphere shifted from eerie to claustrophobic. The breathing on the phone became more frequent, a constant pulse of air that seemed to vibrate against my ear. One night, I sat perfectly still, eyes closed, holding my breath for as long as possible. In the silence, I heard it, a tiny wet sound. It wasn't just a breath anymore. It was the sound of something dragging its weight across the wooden floorboards. I looked down at the workbench. A new note had appeared, placed perfectly in the center. It didn't say anything about the chair or the shadows. It simply read, "I am tired of signing your name. May I borrow yours?" I grabbed my pen, trembling, and wrote a reply, "Take it." The next morning, the booth was silent. The phone didn't ring. There were no notes left on the table. I felt a sense of relief, thinking the entity had finally retreated into the shadows of the drive-in. I reached out to touch the dusty workbench, and my hand brushed against something smooth. It was a final note, tucked under the projector's main gear. It was written in my handwriting, perfectly, beautifully, but it wasn't my choice. The ink was still wet, shimmering like oil. It read, "I have signed your heart into the booth." As I stood up to leave, I felt a sudden, sharp tug at my chest, as if an invisible thread had been pulled tight. My own breath hitched, and for the first time in a week, the breathing on the phone didn't stop when I held mine. It happened simultaneously, because I was no longer the only one exhaling. The echo of the unfinished ward. The heavy oak door finally groaned shut, sealing me inside the silence. I sat in my chair, the weight of the night lifting as the final vibration of static died away into a hum so low it was almost a physical pressure against my eardrums. Everything was still. The figure stood at the far end of the hallway, its twin torsos finally ceasing their frantic, rhythmic twitching. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, feeling the warmth of the room settle into my bones as the shadows reclaimed the corners of the ceiling. Moments before that, the silence had been broken by a sudden, sharp snap, the sound of something heavy landing on the floorboards just behind me. I turned my head and saw it, the creature standing perfectly still in the center of the ward. It was tall, covered in skin that looked like crumpled parchment and textured with tiny, iridescent scales. From the base of its neck sprouted a second, smaller torso. This miniature body had 3 jointed limbs and an extra set of eyes that blinked independently of the main head. It didn't move for a long time, just existed there, a strange biological contradiction in the dim light. Then, the static began. It started as a low crackle, like a radio tune between stations, but it wasn't random. As I watched the creature, the noise began to sharpen into distinct syllables, thousands of overlapping voices whispering at once. They weren't just making noise, they were debating my existence. "It is approaching," one voice hissed through the white noise. "Will it notice the scale?" another queried. The static grew louder, a roar of vocalizations that felt like needles pricking my skin. I realized then that the creature wasn't just moving toward me, it was observing how I reacted to its thoughts. It took a step forward, and the floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned as if complaining under its weight. The second torso on its neck reached out with its 3 limbs, its tiny fingers dancing in the air as if trying to pluck a string of music. As it moved into the light, I saw that its skin wasn't just parchment, it was shifting colors, moving from ochre to a deep, bruised violet. The voices in the static grew clearer, losing their chaotic overlap and focusing on me. "It has heart," they murmured. "The one with the pulse is watching us." I felt my own pulse quicken, syncing with the rhythm of the creature's twin torsos. It was closer now, well within reaching distance. The air around it smelled of ozone and old paper. Every time it breathed, a puff of iridescent dust drifted from its scales into the air. I could see the way the smaller body on its neck leaned toward my face, its 3 eyes wide and unblinking. It wasn't just an observer, it was a collector. The static reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of look, watch, and wait echoing off the whitewashed walls. I felt the urge to run, but the sheer weight of the creature's presence anchored me to my chair. It raised its primary arm, a limb covered in smooth, ivory-colored plates, and pointed a single thick digit at my chest. The static suddenly cut to a dead stop. In that vacuum of sound, I heard one final, singular voice pierce the air, perfectly clear and chillingly intimate. "You're next," it whispered. Before that silence, the ward had been filled with the frantic clicking of its joints. Each movement produced a mechanical tick-tick-tick that competed with the static. The creature moved with a strange, undulating grace, like a ribbon being waved underwater. It didn't have a tail or wings. Instead, its spine curved in a way that allowed it to lean at impossible angles without falling over. I watched as it navigated the rows of empty beds, its smaller torso scouting the path ahead while the main head remained focused on me. The static was my primary companion during those first minutes of walking through the ward. It felt like a thick fog made of sound, muffling my own heartbeat until I felt like a ghost in my own body. At the very beginning of it all, when I first pushed open the heavy door into the memory ward, there was only a faint, distant hum. The air was cool and tasted of dust and lavender. I hadn't seen the creature yet. I had only seen the way the shadows seemed to lean toward the center of the room as if waiting for something to arrive. The very first thing that felt wrong was the lack of symmetry in the silence, the way the ward felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice that the walls weren't just empty, they were listening. The log of the Unearned Mark. Log entry, Day 1. The porch lights on Willow Lane are synchronized now. Every house, from my front door to the cul-de-sac at the end of the block, flickers in a rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of a dying giant. It is midnight, and I am sitting in my study with the brass recorder. I told myself that if I spoke into it, something would listen. The air feels heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and old parchment. I have noticed something strange today, the scar on my left forearm. It is a jagged, silvery line, roughly 3 inches long, shaped like a lightning strike. Yet, as I sit here in the silence, I realize with a jolt that I cannot remember ever earning it. There was no surgery, no fall, no briar patch. It simply appeared this morning, as if my skin had decided to hold on to a memory that my brain hadn't experienced yet. Log entry, Day 3. The lights are getting faster. They pulse in bursts of 3 flash, 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 then a long pause. The scar on my arm has begun to itch. It isn't a normal itch. It feels like something is moving beneath the surface of my skin, a tiny, restless creature trying to push through from the inside. I found myself staring at it for hours. When I close my eyes, I don't see a memory of a wound. I see a flash of white light and the sensation of being pulled upward by a heavy chain. The house feels different now. The corners are stretching. The shadows aren't just darker, they are deeper, as if they have gained volume. Log entry, Day 5. It entered the study tonight. I didn't hear it come in. There was no footfall, no creak of floorboards. It simply arrived. It is a towering figure, nearly 7 feet tall, but it doesn't walk or glide. It moves by rotating its entire body in place, like the hand of a clock sweeping across a dial. Its torso is composed of overlapping copper plates that hum with a low vibration. Instead of a face, it has a single, wide aperture in the center of its head, a glowing, amber slit that pulses in time with the flickering porch lights outside. It doesn't move toward me. It simply pivots, facing me with perfect precision, then rotates again to point toward the door. Log entry, Day 7. The entity is constant now. It occupies the center of the room, and I have learned its rhythm. Every time it completes a full rotation, the scar on my arm glows a dull, bruised purple. It seems to be feeding on the mark. Whenever the amber slit opens wide, I hear a sound like grinding stones coming from within the entity's copper chest. My skin is beginning to pull tight around the scar. The edges of the line are fraying, becoming wider as if the wound is trying to swallow my entire arm. I realize today that the scar isn't a mark left by an event in the past. It is a doorway for what is currently happening. Log entry, Day 9. The rotation has changed. It no longer moves smoothly. It stutters. It pivots 45 degrees, pauses, then jerks another 45. Each movement produces a sharp, metallic click. I am terrified to look at the scar now because it is no longer just on my arm. It is migrating toward my shoulder, stretching toward my chest like a widening crack in a porcelain vase. The entity is leaning inward during its rotations, as if trying to pour something into my skin. It isn't a visitor, it is a weaver. Log entry, day 11. The lights outside have stopped flickering. They are now steady, burning with a fierce, white intensity that makes the shadows in the house retreat to the very edges of the walls. The entity has reached the center of my chest. Its copper plates are vibrating so fast they are becoming a blur. I can feel the scar pulling at my ribs, dragging my breath into a shallow rhythm. It wants to finish the mark. I realized that the reason I couldn't remember earning the scar is because it wasn't an accident. It was an invitation. The entity has been slowly painting the wound onto my body over these many days. Log entry, day 12. The final rotation. The figure stopped halfway through its turn, suspended in a permanent tilt toward me. The amber slit widened until it was a gaping circle of molten gold. At that exact moment, the scar reached my collarbone and snapped shut like a zipper. I felt a sudden, violent tug, as if something had finally stepped through the door. The entity vanished into the wound, its copper plates folding inward until they became a single point of light. Now, the room is silent. The lights are out. My arm feels smooth again, the scar having disappeared completely, leaving behind only a faint warmth. I reached out to touch my skin, expecting to feel the mark, but I felt something else instead. Something moved beneath my skin, not an itch, not a memory, but a tiny, copper-plated weight shifting as it settled into its new home inside my ribcage. The inventory of the invisible step. The inventory was supposed to be simple. My father, a man who lived by the logic of physical space, had left me his house with a final instruction: audit the rooms. I spent my first week counting everything: the chairs, the books, the dust motes dancing in the light. But during the third night of the blackout, the math stopped making sense. The power had died at dusk, plunging the suburban house into a heavy, velvety silence. Without the hum of the refrigerator or the ticking of the wall clock, I became hyper-aware of the physical reality of the hallways. It was then that I noticed the discrepancy in the foyer. My feet knew there was a step between the living room rug and the bottom of the stairs, a slight elevation that required my heel to lift just a fraction of an inch. Yet, when I looked down, the floor was perfectly level. There was no physical riser, no wood grain break, nothing but flat carpet. It felt like a ghost in the architecture, a phantom measurement. To make sense of it, I hung a wide-angle security camera from the ceiling directly above that invisible transition. I wanted to see what my eyes were missing. The first night, the camera sat static. In the low light of my flashlight, the frame showed nothing but empty floor. Then, as I walked across the rug, I felt my foot dip. My brain registered a descent, a subtle drop in altitude that sent a ripple of confusion through my spine. Yet, the camera's lens showed me standing on a flat surface. It was an inventory error, a piece of data existing in my muscles, but absent from my vision. The next night, as I moved toward the kitchen, something shifted. I didn't see it, but the camera did. A tiny, rhythmic twitch occurred in the center of the frame. It looked like a ripple in a pond made of solid wood. Then came the sound, a muffled, wet thud, as if a heavy piece of fruit had fallen onto a soft sofa. The next evening, the audit became harder to balance. I sat in my armchair with a notebook, watching the monitor. Every time I blinked, the camera would swivel just a fraction of a degree. It wasn't tracking me, it was tracking it. Something was moving in that empty space where the step should have been. The entity began to manifest in the periphery of the frame. It wasn't a solid object, but rather a distortion, a pocket of air that seemed thicker than the rest. It looked like a shimmering bead of oil suspended in water. When I walked past it, my foot didn't just dip, it sank. It felt like stepping into a puddle of velvet, a soft, yielding depression that existed only for the millisecond my soul touched it. "Where are you?" I whispered to the empty air. The camera responded by rotating toward the kitchen. On the screen, the distortion grew larger. It started to take on a shape, not a face or a body, but a textured volume. It was a rounded, pulsing mound that looked like a piece of raw honeycomb, glowing with a dull, amber warmth. It wasn't just a missing step anymore, it was a growing inventory item. By the fourth night, the house felt crowded by this invisible guest. I could hear it breathing a low, rhythmic sigh that seemed to come from beneath my feet rather than from a throat. It moved with deliberate intent now. When I sat on the sofa, the camera swiveled toward the corner of the room, and the honeycomb mound slid across the floor like a smooth stone on silk. My eyes still saw nothing but an empty hallway, yet my body felt its presence. When I reached out to touch the space where it lived, my hand didn't hit air. My palm met something firm and slightly tacky, like the surface of a ripe plum. It was there, tucked into the architecture, waiting to be counted. On the final night of the blackout, the inventory finally balanced. The mound had grown large enough to occupy nearly half the foyer. It no longer just waited for me to step on it. It began to pull at my weight. As I walked toward the front door, I felt a sudden, powerful tug. My foot didn't just dip into the invisible step, it was swallowed by it. The camera swiveled one last time, capturing the moment of transition. On the screen, the amber mound stretched out, reaching for my toes like a hungry mouth. I stood there, balanced on that phantom ledge, feeling the weight of the house settle into the space beneath me. I realized then that the step wasn't missing because it was invisible. It was missing because it was occupied by something that didn't want to be seen. I took one more step forward, and my foot sank deep into the amber warmth. The camera recorded the movement perfectly, a steady, rhythmic pulse of the mound as it pulled me inward. I looked down at the floor one last time, watching the spot where my foot had vanished into nothingness. It was finally accounted for in the ledger. Then, from the silent darkness of the hallway, I felt something cold and firm press against my ankle from underneath, pulling me deeper into the gap. The exhale of the void. Entry 01. This is a recording of my voice, though it feels heavier now that I'm speaking it into the silence. The desert outside is flat, a vast stretch of cracked earth and heat haze under a sky so wide it feels like it's trying to swallow the town whole. I pulled into this gas station, a lonely, one-pump outpost on the edge of nowhere, around 2 a.m. The hum of the neon sign above the pump is constant, a buzzing zzz that vibrates in my teeth. I sat in the driver's seat for what felt like 10 minutes, just watching the dust settle when I first felt it. It started as a rhythm, a faint, wet inhalation coming from the passenger seat. At first, I thought it was my own breath caught in the stillness of the car, but then I realized my lungs were still, and the sound continued. Hahoo, a soft, rhythmic puff of air. It wasn't just a sound. There was a slight movement of air that stirred the hair on my arms. I looked over, expecting to see someone, or perhaps a stray dog, but the seat was empty. Only the faint scent of ozone and old copper remained. I laughed it off as an auditory hallucination brought on by the isolation of the desert. But then, the rhythm changed. It didn't just match my breathing anymore. It started to anticipate it. When I took a deep breath in, the air would pull slightly before I did, as if something was preparing for the intake. When I exhaled, the sound followed a fraction of a second later, like an echo that had gained mass. It felt as though the void between galaxies, that vast, hungry dark, had reached out and snagged me by the throat, pulling a piece of itself into my cabin. I tried to focus on the dashboard clock, but my eyes kept drifting to the empty space where the passenger would be. The air there was beginning to shimmer, warped like heat rising off asphalt. It wasn't a ghost, not exactly. It felt more like a puncture in reality. Something was leaking through from the deep dark, and it was trying to learn how to be alive. By the time I reached for my water bottle, the breathing became synchronized. Asterisk in out. In out. Asterisk, my chest rose, and the air moved. My chest fell, and the void exhaled. It was perfect symmetry. Then came the sensation of weight. The passenger seat didn't just have a sound, it had a presence. I could feel a slight depression in the cushion as if something invisible was leaning forward. I finally gathered the courage to look directly at the space where its face should be. There were no eyes to meet, no skin to touch. Instead, there was a cluster of iridescent, vibrating filaments, thousands of tiny, hair-like threads that shimmered like oil on water. They weren't solid, but they moved with intent, swaying in time with the breaths. One of these filaments brushed against my cheek. It felt cold, not like ice, but like the absence of heat. I realized then that it wasn't just mimicking me, it was consuming my rhythm to build its own body. The more it breathed for me, the more my own lungs felt heavy, as if they were being shared with a silent partner. My own breathing began to feel secondary, a rehearsal for the entity's performance. I tried to hold my breath to see what would happen. I counted to 5, my lungs burning with the effort of stillness. When I finally let go, the void took its turn. It didn't wait for me to exhale. It surged forward with a massive, rushing gust of air that tasted of starlight and ancient dust. It was no longer just matching me. It was overtaking me. The filaments began to stretch out further, reaching across the center console toward my hands. They were weaving together, forming a lace-like net of shimmering light in the dark. I felt a sudden, sharp tug on my collarbone. Something was pulling. The breathing was now so loud it felt like a physical pressure against my ears. It wasn't just air anymore, it was a pulse. I realized with a jolt of terror that the entity was no longer content to be a passenger. It was using my body as an anchor, a scaffold upon which it was building its own existence in this world. Every time I breathed out, a bit of my soul seemed to drift into those vibrating threads, and every time it breathed in, it took a piece of the desert's silence with it. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The hum of the neon sign grew louder, then suddenly cut out, plunging us into total darkness. In that moment, the breathing stopped entirely. The silence was absolute. Then, without warning, I felt a soft, wet thud against my shoulder, the sound of something finally finding its weight. It didn't move toward me, it simply settled. I realized then that I wasn't just being observed by the dark between galaxies. I was being invited into it, one breath at a time. I sat there for a long time in the dark, my own lungs finally resting, while the thing on the seat took over completely, its filaments glowing faintly in the gloom as it mastered the art of being me. The inventory of the submerged will. Pressure is a heavy thing, but on the Ethelgard rig, it feels personal. Down here, 3,000 feet below the surface, the ocean doesn't just press against the steel, it listens to it. The atmosphere is thick with the scent of brine and ozone, a metallic tang that settles on the back of my tongue like a constant taste of copper. I was the lone technician during the 3rd week of the deep sea shift, a period usually defined by the rhythmic hum of turbines and the lonely whistle of steam through the pipes. It is a symphony of solitude, where the ticking of a clock feels like a heartbeat in a cavernous chest. That changed when the voice began to speak from the vents. It wasn't a human voice, not exactly. It sounded like the friction of velvet rubbing against rusted iron, vibrating through the metal ribs of the rig until my very teeth seemed to ache with the resonance. At first, I thought it was an echo of my own thoughts, a phantom byproduct of isolation, the brain's way of filling the void when there is nothing else to hear. But then, the voice started narrating my actions before I even took them. It became a prophet of the immediate present. When I reached for my wrench, it whispered, "You will grasp the cold steel." My fingers would close around the handle just as the syllables finished their journey through the air. When I blinked in exhaustion, it murmured, "You will close your eyes to see the dark." It became a constant companion, a rhythmic commentary on my existence, turning every mundane motion into a scripted performance. One evening, while checking the pressure gauges in sublevel 4, a damp corridor where the walls wept condensation in steady, crystalline beads, the voice stopped narrating and began to speak for itself. The transition was jarring. It ceased being a narrator of my life and became a storyteller of its own. It told me that it was preparing its last will and testament. It spoke of items it intended to bequeath, treasures it had collected from the seabed over eons, things it promised to give away once my shift finally ended. "I give you the hum of the whale's migration," it whispered as I walked through a corridor, the sound feeling like a phantom current moving against my skin. "I give you the weight of the silt." It was peculiar because these were not my memories, they were its possessions. The voice felt like an inheritance from a ghost who had never lived, a benefactor who was handing over pieces of a world I hadn't seen, but could now feel in the marrow of my bones. As the days passed, the narration became more frantic, more specific. It began to describe the physical presence of its owner in the vents, a creature that didn't just inhabit the rig, but owned it. The voice grew impatient, its velvet iron texture sharpening into something more urgent. On the final night, the voice announced it would reveal the bequeather itself. I felt a strange pull toward the center of the structure, a magnetic tug in my chest. I walked toward the central hub, where the largest ventilation shaft opened like a giant, gaping mouth. The air here was colder, vibrating with a low-frequency thrum that made the hair on my arms stand up. From the darkness of the vent, the entity emerged. It was a magnificent, terrifying sight. The body was sliced into perfectly horizontal stripes of varying colors, deep indigo, ochre, vibrant crimson, and a pale, sickly mint green, as if it had been sliced by a laser and stacked like a deck of cards. Each stripe seemed to hold its own depth, reflecting the dim light of my headlamp in different ways. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head was a smooth, iridescent dome that shimmered with every movement, shifting from pearlescent white to a bruised purple. Most unsettling were its sensory organs. Where a nose should be, there was a small, pulsing gold disc that beat like a tiny heart. And where a mouth would sit, there was no opening for speech. Instead, it held one long, unbroken tone, a constant, steady musical note that vibrated through the air like a cello string held indefinitely. It didn't speak with its lips, it radiated its existence through that singular, haunting frequency. The entity moved toward me, its striped body swaying in time with its own hum, moving with the grace of a ribbon caught in a slow current. It reached out a limb that looked like a polished piece of mahogany and touched my chest. The contact was cool, almost dry. "I give you the final gift," it vibrated, the note shifting slightly in pitch as if it were sighing. The memory of what I was before I was sliced. As the entity retreated back into the vent, the colors of its body began to fade, turning into a dull, uniform copper. It stayed there for a moment, its gold disc pulsing one last time against the shadows. Then, it vanished completely into the pipes, leaving the rig in total silence. The hum stopped. I stood alone in the hub, realizing that the voice was gone, and with it, the owner of the will had left me with everything it owned, including the realization that it had finally finished spending its life on me. The Keeper's Deficit. I have spent my life measuring the dark, but during the Great Siege, I realized that time does not always move in a straight line. The blackout took the sun, but it also stretched the shadows into something physical. My job was to maintain the lighthouse on the jagged tooth of the coast, but as the war drained our oil and coal, my role became one of preservation. Every night, I kept a logbook. I would sit in my wooden rocking chair by the hearth, watching the wick burn down and record the hours. However, during the third month of the blackout, the numbers began to betray me. On Tuesday, I wrote, "Hour 14, the fire is steady." Then I turned the page. It read, "Hour 14, the fire is steady." I had not moved my pen, yet the hour refused to pass. It was as if time had snagged on a splinter of reality. That was the night the rocking chair started moving without me. I sat in it, and when I stood up to fetch a cup of water, the chair continued to sway behind me. It didn't just move, it moved with purpose, a rhythmic, heavy thrum against the floorboards. I returned to my seat, but the motion had stopped perfectly at the midpoint of a swing. When I sat again, it resumed instantly. I began to notice that the more I left the chair, the more the room seemed to hold on to its momentum. By the fourth night, the chair was no longer just moving. It was vibrating with a low, humming frequency that made my teeth ache. I stepped into the hallway to check the oil reserves, and when I looked back, the chair was still rocking, but the sound had changed. It sounded like a heavy velvet curtain being dragged across whetstone. Then came the entity. At first, I thought it was merely a trick of the flickering lantern. A shape appeared in the corner of the room, hovering just behind my chair. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It looked like a mass of woven copper wire and translucent silk, suspended in midair. It had no face, but rather a surface of shifting geometric plates that clicked against one another like clockwork gears. The strangest thing about it was its orientation. When it moved toward the door, its front stayed perfectly oriented toward me, as if my very existence was the North Pole of its universe. I walked to the far wall and turned my back on it, but the entity didn't turn away. It simply pivoted its entire body to keep its copper wire chest facing my spine. It moved with a jittery, staccato grace, shrinking in size as it drifted further away, yet never losing that singular focus. I tried to outrun it. I sprinted to the balcony and looked out at the Black Sea, but even there, the entity moved toward the railing, its plates clicking rapidly so that it could keep my face in its sight. I realized then that the rocking chair was not just a piece of furniture, it was an anchor. Every time I left the room, the chair would rock faster and faster, as if trying to pull me back into the orbit of the hearth. By the 7th night, the logbook began to show the true distortion. I wrote, Hour 15. The next line read, Hour 0. Time had looped. The entity was now moving across the floor in a constant, sweeping arc, its copper wires shimmering. It never walked away, it only migrated, always maintaining that unwavering gaze upon my throat. I sat in the chair one last time, closing my eyes and trying to ignore the ticking of its plates. I felt a sudden, sharp tug in my chest, as if an invisible hook had snagged my ribs. I opened my eyes to find the entity mere inches from my nose. It hadn't moved toward me. It had simply folded itself inward until its many plates converged into a single point. It was no longer watching me from across the room. It was trying to pull the room into itself. The rocking chair gave one final, violent lurch and then froze, locked in place like a statue. I stood up, my limbs feeling heavy as lead, and realized the entity had stopped moving because it had finally reached its destination. It didn't retreat. It settled onto the floor between my feet, a tangled heap of copper and silk still, facing me with every geometric plate aligned toward my heart. I sat down in the chair, which was now perfectly still, and felt the warmth of the entity's presence against my shins. The blackout was still there, the war was still raging outside, and the lighthouse stood tall, but for a moment, the world held its breath. I reached out to touch the copper wires, and they hummed with a vibration that felt like a heartbeat. Then, the chair began to rock again on its own, moving in perfect synchronization with the entity's pulse. I realized then that it wasn't just watching me, it was waiting for me to join its stillness. The logbook sat open on my lap, and as I looked down at the final entry, the ink bled into a shape I hadn't drawn. It was a perfect circle, surrounding a single dot. The entity shifted slightly, its plates clicking once in the silence. I felt its presence tighten, a constant pressure against my soul, ensuring that even when I closed my eyes, it never looked away. The saturated guest. I never thought to look for a shadow until the air started to smell like pond water and wet wool. It was 2 a.m., that hollow hour when the city feels less like a place and more like a memory. I was walking down a dead-end block, my sneakers slapping against the pavement in a rhythmic cadence that seemed to echo longer than it should have. At the end of the street stood an all-night corner store, its neon sign humming a low, vibrating note that vibrated in my molars. The door groaned as I pushed it open, and I was greeted by the smell of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. It was nearly empty, save for a few jars of pickles on the counter and a row of dented soda cans. As I reached for a bag of pretzels, the first sensation hit me, a heavy warmth just above my left shoulder. It wasn't a physical touch yet, not quite, but it felt like a palm resting there, a deliberate weight that pressed against my skin without actually making contact. I froze, my hand hovering over the shelf. The air around my neck grew humid, and I heard a faint, rhythmic dripping sound, even though the nearest leak was a leaky faucet at the back of the shop. I turned my head slightly to the left, but there was nothing there but the dim glow of the fluorescent tubes. I told myself it was just the atmosphere of an empty store, a trick of the senses in the middle of the night. But as I moved toward the register, the weight shifted. It followed me, hovering exactly 3 inches above my shoulder like a silent companion. It felt thick and heavy, as if something with significant mass was leaning into my personal space. Then came the sound, a soft, squelching noise, like boots pulling out of mud. I looked at my own clothes. They were perfectly dry. Yet, where that invisible weight rested, a small patch of my shirt began to turn dark and damp. It wasn't just wet, it was soaked, as if a steady rain had been falling on that one specific spot for hours. I stood still, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dripping grew louder, becoming a constant pitter-patter on the floor around my feet, yet no water was falling from above. It was coming from the entity itself. I finally gathered the courage to look directly at the space where the weight resided. There was no solid body, but there was a presence, a creature made of heavy, sodden fabric and dripping texture. It looked like a person caught in a perpetual downpour, its clothes saturated with water that never seemed to run out. It had a face composed of smooth, wet clay, with a wide mouth that stayed slightly open as if it were about to exhale. Its hair was clumped into thick, heavy ropes that clung to its brow like seaweed. The best part, or the most unsettling part, was how it moved. It didn't walk, it slid through the air, leaving a trail of moisture behind it. I could see the water droplets fly off its body, hitting my face and neck with cool precision. "Are you following me?" I whispered to the empty air. The entity didn't speak, but the weight on my shoulder increased, becoming firm enough that I felt the curve of a knuckle pressing against my collarbone. It leaned in closer, its wet clothes rustling like a forest floor after a storm. Every time it moved, the store filled with the scent of deep sea salt and rotting lilies. I realized then that it wasn't just standing there, it was observing me, measuring the distance between our two worlds. The dripping became frantic now, the sound of water hitting the linoleum sounding like dozens of tiny fingers tapping in unison. I reached out a trembling hand to touch its shoulder, but my fingers only met a puff of cold mist and a few stray beads of water. It moved from my left shoulder to my right, crossing over my spine with a graceful, liquid motion. I felt the moisture seep into my skin, a sudden chill that made my breath hitch in my throat. The creature began to pulse, its clay-like face rippling as if something were moving underneath the surface of its skin. It was no longer just a weight, it was a constant companion, a silent observer of my mundane movements. I felt a strange sense of intimacy with it, a weird comfort in knowing that even in this dead-end block, I wasn't entirely alone. But as I turned to leave the store, the dripping slowed to a crawl. The creature moved back to my left shoulder, settling into its favorite spot with a satisfied hum of water. I pushed open the door and stepped out into the night air, the silence of the street wrapping around me like a blanket. I started to walk home, the weight still there, steady and sure. As I reached my front porch, I finally turned around to face it one last time before stepping inside. The creature was standing right behind me, its wet clothes gleaming under the porch light, its clay face stretched into a wide, expectant grin. It didn't move away as I entered. It stayed on my shoulder, dripping a single, final bead of water onto my neck. I walked into the hallway and felt the weight settle against my spine once more, but when I looked back, the creature was no longer just hovering. It had moved its head forward until its wet nose was almost touching my ear, and I realized it wasn't just following me, it was waiting for me to fall asleep so it could finally touch me. The latency of the unspoken. I am writing this for you, though I know you cannot speak back. You are the stranger sitting 3 booths down in the fluorescent diner, your face hidden behind a steaming mug of coffee. Outside, the rain has turned the gravel into a slurry of mud, and the last bus of the night sits idling at the curb like a tired beast waiting to be fed. It is 3 a.m., that hollow hour where the world feels suspended between exhaled breath and a new beginning. I am here because there was nothing else left to do, and because the Wi-Fi signal caught my attention from the moment I stepped through the heavy glass doors. I looked at my phone, searching for a connection, and saw it among the standard offerings, the secret of my 10th birthday. It was a peculiar name. Most networks were named after brands or locations, but this one felt personal, almost intimate. It was the exact thought I had never dared to say out loud, the secret realization that when I am alone in a room, I feel as though the walls are leaning in just slightly to listen. I tapped it, and my device hummed with a connection that felt heavy. Not fast, but weighted. That was when I first noticed the reflection in the large bay window at the front of the diner. At first, it seemed normal. It showed me sitting in my booth, my chin resting on my palm, watching the rain. But as I lifted my coffee mug to take a sip, something felt wrong with the timing. My reflection didn't wait for me to move. Just as the ceramic touched my lower lip, The reflection's cup had already reached its peak height and was beginning to descend back toward the table. It wasn't just moving, it was anticipating me. I froze. I blinked, then performed a deliberate test. I slowly raised my right hand and curled my fingers into a fist. The reflection moved with a slight, fluid grace, closing its fist exactly half a second before my own knuckles met. It wasn't a mirror image in the traditional sense, it was a predecessor. Every twitch of my eyebrows was mirrored by a corresponding arch of the reflection's brows just before I felt the muscle contract. I looked back at the window, trying to find a reason for the discrepancy. The entity in the glass had a face that was remarkably similar to mine, yet it possessed a texture like weathered copper, a slight metallic sheen over the skin, and a faint seam running along the jawline where its chin met its neck. Its hair wasn't strands, but tiny, overlapping scales of deep bronze. It didn't have my messy fringe. Instead, it wore its hair in a series of tight, organized spirals that pulsed slightly with each beat of its heart. I decided to lean into the rhythm. I began to conduct a small symphony of movements. I tapped my fingers on the table, tap, 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 tap. The reflection responded, tap, 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 tap. It was ahead of me, choreographing my life in real time. Then I noticed its expression. While I was trying to maintain a look of mild curiosity, the reflection looked hungry. Its mouth remained slightly parted, showing teeth that were squared and flat like those of a horse, rather than sharp like mine. The air in the diner grew thick. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to synchronize with the movement of the glass self. I tried to turn my head to the left, but the reflection had already pivoted its neck to the right, then swung back to follow me, as if it were trying to catch up to a lead that it was simultaneously creating. It was no longer just mimicking, it was leading. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, a pulling feeling, as if an invisible thread was tied from my heart to the reflection center. I realized that because the entity moved first, I was constantly reacting to its initiative. If I stopped moving entirely, the reflection continued for one more beat before coming to rest, like a pendulum finally settling into place. It was as if it were the source of the motion, and my body was merely the echo. I reached out toward the glass, my fingers hovering inches from the surface. In the reflection, the bronze-scaled hand had already pressed against the pane. I felt a sudden, sharp chill on my skin where my fingertips were still hanging in the air. The reflection wasn't just waiting for me to touch it, it was pushing against the barrier from the other side, eager to bridge the gap. Then, the lights in the diner flickered once and died completely. In that second of absolute darkness, I heard a soft sound, a wet, sliding noise like silk being pulled over stone. When the fluorescent tubes buzzed back to life, I gasped. The reflection was no longer sitting in its spot. It had leaned forward so far that its face was pressed against the glass, its bronze scales shimmering under the white light. But it wasn't looking at me anymore. It was looking at the space just behind my left shoulder. I felt a sudden prickle on my neck. I turned my head quickly to see what it was watching. There was nothing there but the empty air of the diner. However, in the window, the reflection didn't turn its head. It kept its eyes fixed on that empty spot, its mouth widening into a wide, toothy grin of anticipation. I realized then that the reflection wasn't just reacting to my movements anymore, it was reacting to something I couldn't see yet. The entity in the glass stayed perfectly still, but it reached out and gripped the edge of the window frame with its flat-toothed mouth, as if it were waiting for me to finally turn around and meet whatever was standing right behind my chair. The passenger of the unmarked cellar. I've always preferred the quiet rhythm of late-night driving. There is a specific clarity to the world at 2 a.m., where the streetlights act as lonely beacons and the hum of the tires on asphalt creates a private sanctuary. That night, I was running a standard rideshare for a passenger who hadn't specified a destination, only an address that appeared on my screen as the old farmhouse, Root Cellar. It was a rural stretch of land, miles from the nearest town, where the air felt heavy and tasted of damp earth. As we turned onto the dirt path, my GPS began to stutter. The blue line representing our route started to twitch, recalculating every few seconds, as if it were trying to find a way into a space that didn't quite exist on the map. My passenger sat perfectly still in the back seat. She wasn't just sitting, she was anchored. She wore a heavy wool coat of deep indigo and held a small lantern that cast a warm, amber glow across her features. She had no hair, only skin that looked like smooth river stone. Her face was wide and symmetrical, dominated by 3 distinct sets of eyes, 2 on the bridge of her nose and 1 larger eye positioned just above her chin. They were the color of tarnished brass. The most unsettling thing about her, however, was her stillness. She didn't fidget. She didn't shift her weight or adjust her grip on the lantern. She simply occupied the space. As we approached the farmhouse, a skeletal structure of timber and sagging porch, the GPS went haywire again. The little car icon began to spin in a dizzying circle, yet our speed remained constant. I pulled over near the cellar entrance, which was a heavy wooden hatch set into the ground like a gaping mouth. "We're here," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the vacuum of the yard. The passenger didn't move her head, but her 3 brass eyes shifted toward me simultaneously. "Is it time?" she asked. Her voice wasn't a sound so much as a vibration in the air, like a low cello string being plucked. I stepped out and opened the hatch. A scent of ancient dust and fermented fruit wafted up. I expected her to walk down into the cellar alone, but she remained seated for a moment, watching me with that unwavering gaze. I realized then that she wasn't just looking at me, she was measuring me. The silence in the yard felt different, thicker than usual. It was as if the atmosphere were being sucked toward the hole in the ground. I climbed down into the cellar. It was a vast, subterranean chamber lined with rough-hewn stones. In the center sat a single chair made of twisted driftwood and a small table holding a bowl of smooth pebbles. There were no clocks here, yet I could feel the absence of time. Usually, in a cellar this old, you expect to hear the rhythmic drip of water or the groan of settling wood, but here, the silence was absolute. It was a pocket of stillness where the heartbeat of time had been surgically removed. I sat across from her. The lantern she held flickered, casting shadows that didn't dance. They stayed fixed against the walls like stains of ink. "Why are you so still?" I whispered, the question escaping before I could stop it. She finally moved, not a shift of her body, but a slight expansion of her chest. "The ticking is loud," she replied. "In the world above, everything clicks and talks. Here, we have stolen the seconds." I looked at her face again. In the absolute silence, I noticed something new. Her eyes weren't just watching me, they were recording me. Every time a second passed in my mind, she seemed to pull a bit more of my surroundings into her own stillness. The dust motes stopped midair as if frozen in amber. My own breathing slowed until it became almost imperceptible. Then, the recalculating GPS in my pocket let out one final, frantic beep and went dead. I looked back up at the hatch, expecting to see the moon or the stars, but they were gone. The cellar had swallowed the rest of the world. She reached out with a hand that had 6 joints instead of 4 and touched the table. "You are part of the collection now," she said. I felt my own limbs begin to heavy, my muscles losing their tension as if they were turning into marble. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like heavy pillars. I realized then that her stillness wasn't a lack of motion. It was an active force. It was a vacuum that pulled the becoming out of everything it touched. I looked at my own hand as it rested on the table. The skin was no longer just skin, it was becoming a permanent state of being. I could feel my pulse slowing, fighting against the heavy, silent gravity of her presence. She wasn't just a passenger anymore, she was the keeper of this frozen moment. The lantern light flickered once and died, leaving us in a twilight that never changed. I tried to speak one last time, but even my voice had been pulled into the stillness. I am still sitting here, though still is no longer a description, but a physical weight. I can feel her 3 brass eyes watching me as my own face begins to harden into its permanent shape. The silence is no longer empty. It is full of everything we used to be, held perfectly motionless in the dark. When I finally reached out to touch her hand, my fingers didn't move through the air so much as they merged with her skin, and I realized that she was waiting for me to stop trying to move altogether, waiting for the moment when even my thought would cease to ripple, leaving only the quiet rhythm of the stillness. The vocabulary of the void. In our town, we do not speak of truth as a solid thing. We call it verity, which is what we see when the sun hits the mudflats just right. We do not call the ocean water, we call it the heavy breath. And most importantly, we do not call the creature in the tide gauge shack a ghost. We call it the interval. I moved to this coast because of my job. I am the keeper of the gauge. My life is spent in a small wooden shack perched on the edge of a black mudflat that stretches out like a bruised skin over the earth. When the tide retreats, the mud groans. It makes a sound people call sighing, though it sounds more like 1,000 wet lungs exhaling at once. My routine was simple until I found the spool of film in the corner of the shack. It wasn't there when I moved in. It sat in a rusted tin, wrapped in oilcloth. When I threaded it through my projector, the flickering light revealed a home video that shouldn't have existed. It showed a birthday party held in a garden. There was a cake with candles, a table set for 6, and a group of children laughing. But there was one oddity. The mother in the video was holding a small boy who wasn't there in the physical sense. She was reaching out her arms, her hands cupping an invisible weight, her face beaming as if she were cradling a miracle. I watched it 3 times. Each time, I noticed something wrong. The children weren't just reacting to a guest, they were leaning toward a specific patch of empty air. It was as if the boy occupied space, pushing against the atmosphere. Then I saw the mother's eyes. She wasn't looking at her guests. She was looking at the interval. In our town, we describe the interval not by what it is, but by what it lacks. It is the missing stair your feet always remember and your eyes can never find. When you walk through a hallway, your brain anticipates a step, a solid rise of wood or stone to meet your heel, but instead, your foot falls into a brief, terrifying lurch of weightlessness before landing on the floor below. You feel it in your marrow. Your muscles contract for a surface that isn't there until the very millisecond you arrive. I began to feel the interval more clearly in the shack. At first, I thought the floorboards were just uneven. But then came the mornings where my foot would dip into a pocket of nothingness right as I stepped out of bed. It felt like stepping onto a submerged ledge that only existed for the duration of the step. My eyes saw flat wood, my feet felt a drop. One evening, while the tide was in its stretching phase, the moment when the mud pulls away from the shore with a rhythmic tug, I sat on the floor and tried to map it out. I closed my eyes and moved my foot forward. It dropped. I opened my eyes. There was nothing but the floorboard. I returned to the film. As I watched the birthday party again, I realized why the mother looked so happy. She wasn't holding an invisible boy, she was holding the interval itself. In the video, the children weren't just laughing at a guest, they were reaching into the missing space where the boy lived. Then, the footage changed. The colors bled from the garden. The cake vanished. The children remained, but their faces shifted from joy to a strange, wide-eyed recognition. They began to lean further into that empty patch of air. And then it appeared. It wasn't a shape so much as a ripple in the reality of the room. It looked like a fold in a piece of silk, a slight distortion where the air seemed to thicken and curve. It had no skin, no hair, and no face. It was simply a presence that occupied the space between what is seen and what is felt. I stood up from my chair and took a step toward the projector. My foot fell into the void. It didn't just drop this time. It stayed there for a heartbeat longer than it should have. The floorboard beneath my foot seemed to ripple like water. I felt a slight pressure against my toes, as if something was pushing back up from the bottom of the hole. I reached out my hand into the empty air in front of me. My fingers didn't hit a wall, but they met resistance. It felt like dipping my hand into warm wax. The temperature of the room dropped by 5 degrees. I could hear it now, a faint, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat muffled by deep water. I realized then that the interval wasn't just a sensory glitch. It was an inhabitant. It lived in the gaps of our lives. It lived in the spaces between words and the seconds between heartbeats. It was the thing that existed when we weren't looking, waiting for us to notice its lack of presence. I watched the film one last time. The children were now reaching out so far they were almost falling forward into the empty space where the boy used to be. The mother leaned in too. For a second, her head vanished into the ripple, her hair flowing into the nothingness, as if she were submerging into a pond. I stood in the center of my shack, the projector humming like a loyal pet. I took a deep breath and stepped forward again. My foot sank into the missing stair, and for the first time, it didn't just fall. It stayed there, held firmly by something on the other side. My foot was no longer touching the wood of the shack. It was resting on the surface of the thing my eyes could never see. I felt a gentle tug at my toes, a soft, pulling sensation that suggested the interval was finally inviting me to sit down. The resolution of the unfinished guest. Photograph 1. The nursery is a patchwork of history, half covered in a soft sage paint that hasn't quite reached the high crown molding. Photograph 2. I sat in the rocking chair because the floorboards groaned under my weight like old teeth settling into place. Photograph 3. In the corner stood the cabinet, its wood grains swirling in patterns that looked like frozen water. Photograph 4. It began with a rhythm, a soft inhale and exhale that didn't belong to me. Photo 5. I checked the corners of the ceiling, searching for dust motes or the weight of my own heartbeat. Photo 6. Then came the first true sound, a breath that mirrored mine perfectly in pitch and duration. Is someone there? I whispered into the stillness of the afternoon. Photograph 7. The entity appeared in the center of the room, a creature made of geometry rather than smooth flesh. It was a blocky ghost, its body composed of sharp, cuboid segments that looked like they were still being rendered by an invisible artist. Photo 8. Its torso was a series of stacked rectangles with edges so sharp they seemed to slice the air, and its limbs weren't smooth, but jagged, like a staircase carved from smoke. Photograph 9. It didn't have hair or skin. It had surfaces. The front of its chest was a flat plane of ochre, while its shoulders were deep, square indents. Photo 10. As I watched, the entity moved with a stuttering grace, each step a sudden shift from one block to the next. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense, but rather a series of protruding prisms that suggested a nose and eyes without needing to define them. Photograph 11. The breathing was the most haunting part. It wasn't just simultaneous. When I inhaled, its ochre chest expanded into a perfect cube. When I exhaled, its sides collapsed inward with a faint, dry hum. Photograph 12. It moved closer, its blocky feet making no sound on the floorboards. "You're late," it murmured, the voice sounding like two stones grinding together. Photo 13. The entity stopped exactly 3 feet from my chair, its sharp corners hovering just inches from my own shoulders. Photograph 14. I noticed that its edges were never fully finished. Some sides were crisp and straight, while others were blurred and fuzzy, as if it were a drawing that had been interrupted halfway through. Photo 15. It reached out a hand, a cluster of 3 interlocking cubes, and touched my own chest. Photograph 16. The synchronization became absolute. My lungs felt heavy, forced to expand by the ghost's proximity. Photo 17. I realized that as it breathed, it was stealing the air from my own throat first. "Do not fear the pulse," it whispered. Photograph 18. Its body began to change color, shifting from ochre to a deep, bruised violet where it touched my skin. Photo 19. The stuttering movement of its limbs slowed until it became almost still. Yet the breathing remained frantic and perfect. Photo 20. I felt a strange pull in my ribcage, as if my own lungs were trying to become square. Photo 21. It leaned forward, its unfinished edges finally smoothing out into sharp, polished facets. Photograph 22. The room grew cold, the sage. Paint on the walls seeming to dim under its presence. Photo 23. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of its blocky head resting against mine. Photograph 24. It spoke one last time, a sound that vibrated through my very bones. "We are becoming one." Photo 25. I opened my eyes and saw the entity was no longer separate from me. It had merged into my shadow, its cube-shaped body now defining my outline. Photograph 26. The breathing stopped suddenly, leaving a vacuum of silence in the nursery. Photo 27. I sat perfectly still, my own chest feeling rigid and structured like masonry. Photograph 28. I looked down at my hands and saw that my fingers were no longer rounded, but had become flat, sharp-edged rectangles. Backslash photograph 29. The ghost was gone, yet the weight of it remained anchored to my spine. Backslash photo 30. I stood up to leave, but as I moved, my body made a clicking sound. Like a machine locking into place. Backslash photograph 31. I realized that while the entity had vanished from sight, it hadn't left the room. It had simply moved inside of me. Backslash photo 32. I looked at the wall where it had stood and saw the sage paint was now perfectly smooth. Backslash photograph 33. My own breath returned, but it no longer felt like a fluid motion. It felt like a series of clicks, each inhale a new block being added to my internal architecture. Backslash photo 34. I reached out to touch the cabinet again, feeling the texture of my own skin change under my fingertips. Backslash photograph 35. My thumb was now a perfect cube, its edge sharp enough to catch the light like a cut diamond. Backslash photo 36. The room felt larger, emptier, as if the ghost had traded its physical space for my internal structure. Backslash photograph 37. I walked toward the door, feeling my hips and shoulders square off into heavy, solid planes. Backslash photo 38. Every movement was deliberate, a geometric progression of motion rather than a fluid glide. Backslash photograph 39. The nursery felt silent, but in my head, I could still hear that faint, dry hum of its breathing. Backslash photo 40. I stopped at the threshold, looking back one last time at the half-painted room. Backslash photograph 41. I saw a small piece of dust on the floor and realized it was also starting to turn into a cube. Backslash photo 42. I felt my jaw tighten into a sharp right angle as I prepared to speak. Backslash photograph 43. The sensation of being me was fading, replaced by the sensation of being built. Photo 44. I noticed that when I blinked, my eyelids moved in straight lines rather than curves. Backslash photograph 45. The ghost's influence was reaching into the very marrow of my bones. Backslash photo 46. It wasn't just a visitor anymore. It was the blueprint for my new existence. Backslash photograph 47. I felt my spine lengthen and widen, becoming a ladder of sturdy rungs. Backslash photo 48. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange structural stability. Photograph 49. I realized that I could no longer feel the softness of the chair or the curves of the ceiling. Backslash photo 50. Everything in the world began to look like it was made of corners and planes. Backslash photograph 51. I took one step out into the hallway, my foot landing with a solid, satisfying thud. Backslash photo 52. My shadow on the floor wasn't a fluid shape anymore. It was a series of distinct, blocky silhouettes. Backslash photograph 53. The transition was nearly complete. I felt less like a person and more like a monument. Backslash photo 54. I could feel the ghost watching from inside my ribcage, satisfied with its new home. Backslash photograph 55. I reached for the door handle, my cube-shaped hand gripping the metal. Backslash photo 56. The wood of the door felt less like a surface and more like a series of stacked layers. Backslash photograph 57. My voice, when it finally came, was no longer a melody, but a sequence of sharp notes. I am finished, I said. Photo 58. The echo of my voice didn't fade. It bounced off the walls in perfect 90-degree angles. Backslash photograph 59. I realized that the nursery was still half repainted because the ghost hadn't reached that corner yet. Backslash photo 60. But now, as I stood in the doorway, I could feel myself beginning to spread across the walls. Backslash photograph 61. My arms felt like they were extending into the air, seeking out new edges to claim. Backslash photo 62. The room itself seemed to be waiting for me to finish its own transformation. Backslash photograph 63. I looked at my reflection in the window and saw a face made of sharp, clean planes. Backslash photo 64. There was no curve left in my cheek, no roundness in my chin. Backslash photograph 65. The sadness of losing my fluidity was replaced by the pride of my new permanence. Backslash photo 66. I felt the last bit of my soft self dissolve into the blocky ghost structure. Backslash photograph 67. My heart didn't beat anymore. It clicked like a heavy gate opening and closing. Photo 68. The nursery was silent, save for the sound of my own geometric thoughts. Photograph 69. I took another step, and the floorboard beneath me turned into a perfect square. Photo 70. It wasn't just that I had become the ghost. It was that the ghost had decided to rebuild the world in its image. Photograph 71. The sage paint on the wall began to crack into a grid of tiny rectangles. Photo 72. I felt my teeth align into a row of perfect, sharp prisms. Photograph 73. Every time I breathed, a new piece of the room snapped into a new shape. Photo 74. It was a slow, methodical conquest of the curves by the corners. Photograph 75. I stood in the center of the nursery, my body now a masterpiece of construction. Photo 76. The ghost's presence was no longer an external force, but my very skeleton. Photograph 77. I could feel its unfinished edges finally settling into their permanent positions. Photo 78. The transition was total. There was nothing left of the boy who had walked in. Photograph 79. I looked at my hand and saw it was perfectly still, a steady block of form. Photo 80. The nursery was no longer just a room. It was a gallery of my new geometry. Photograph 81. I felt the last bit of fluid motion leave my body like a departing vapor. Photo 82. I was solid. I was structured. I was resolved. Photograph 83. I looked at the chair and saw it had become a series of stacked rectangles. Photo 84. Even the air seemed to have corners now, hanging in the room like invisible cubes. Photograph 85. My breath was no longer a sound. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse of expansion. Photo 86. I realized that I would never be soft again, and yet I had never felt more complete. Photograph 87. The door to the nursery stood open, inviting the rest of the house to be reorganized. Photo 88. I watched as the crown molding began to straighten into a series of sharp teeth. Photograph 89. My body hummed with the energy of its own completion. Photo 90. I felt the ghost's final thought echo in my mind like a ringing bell. Photograph 91. It was no longer an inhabitant. It was the architect of my new self. Photo 92. The nursery grew dim as the colors settled into flat, matte planes. Photograph 93. I stood motionless, a blocky statue of a man in a room of sharp lines. Photo 94. Every curve had been defeated by the uncompromising truth of the edge. Photograph 95. My fingers were no longer 5 parts. They were a sequence of 3 joined cubes. Photograph 96. The nursery was mine, and I was the ghost that lived within its walls. Photo 97. I waited for someone to enter and see what had become of the soft world. Photograph 98. But as I watched them approach, I felt my own edges start to reach out for theirs. Photo 99. The transition was not a death, but an upgrade into something more permanent than flesh. Photograph 100. I reached out to greet the visitor, and as they touched my hand, their skin began to square. The nursery is a patchwork of history, half covered in a soft sage paint that hasn't quite reached the high crown molding. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.